Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise to give a ministerial statement to update Parliament on the achievements and progress made by the Fijian Government on the ratification of core human rights instruments and the progress made by the Fijian Government in translating these into our national laws and policies, and indeed a practical application of these conventions and rights. The Fijian Government is firmly committed to advancing and protecting the fundamental principles and values of universal human rights enunciated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whilst cultivating an ethos of responsible human rights culture. The core 9 referred to often, Madam Speaker, as the big 9 human rights instruments are, firstly, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or CERD, which is from 1965. Number 2, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, is commonly known, from 1966. International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or ISCRA as it's known, from 1966. Convention, number 4, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW as it's called, from 1979. Number 5, Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, or CAT as it's called, from 1984. Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CRC, from 1989. These are when the convention actually came into being at the UN level. G, the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, or it's known as IMC or IMCW, came into being in 1990. The 8th one, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or CRPD, which came into being in 2006. And International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, or CBED, it's called, from 2006. Madam Speaker, with the ratification of CAT and CRPD by this government through this Parliament, we have ratified a total of 5 out of the 9 core human rights instruments, and we are committed to the ratification of all the human rights instruments by 2020, which is in less than 2 years' time. Yesterday, Madam Speaker, we moved a motion, on Monday, we moved a motion that the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defence review the ICCPR and ISCRA instruments for ratification. We envisage that we will also be able to ratify ICCPR and ISCRA this year, in the next session, leaving us with only 2 more instruments to ratify, Madam Speaker. In other words, Madam Speaker, we have ratified 7 out of 9 by next month. Madam Speaker, it is clear that Fiji is now on a fast track towards ratification of all 9 conventions, and we are on the fast track for one reason: the foundation of comprehensive and wide-reaching human rights protections that are enshrined for all time in the Fijian Constitution. Madam Speaker, the Fijian Constitution remains one of the most impressive and progressive constitutions of the world today. It remains, as always, the cornerstone of our democracy, with a vast array of protections and rights upheld in its Bill of Rights. More importantly, Madam Speaker, the application of such rights in Fiji is no longer simply confined to their vertical application, in other words, application against the state only, but also horizontally it's applied now. In other words, these rights are now also enforceable against private actors within our society. Further, these rights are enforceable through an independent judiciary and by the Human Rights Anti-Discrimination Commission. It is also important to highlight that in interpreting the Bill of Rights provisions, the Constitution empowers the judiciary specifically, when relevant, to also consider international law applicable to the protection of the rights and freedoms that are outlined under the Bill of Rights. It is this Constitution, Madam Speaker, that has made it easier than ever before to comply with and ratify the big 9 human rights instruments, Madam Speaker. And by adhering to our Constitution and the Bill of Rights within this Constitution, Madam Speaker, this government has done far more than any other government in our history to further the protection of human rights of every Fijian, everywhere in Fiji. Madam Speaker, take for example the ICCPR and ISCRA. The rights under both of these instruments are already clearly protected by our own Constitution. The articles of the ICCPR call for the right of self-determination, life and freedom from torture, cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment. They prohibit all forms of slavery and protect against arbitrary detention or arrests, and cover provision of the state of emergency and derogation of rights. They also urge state parties to ensure that the civil political rights of the people are realized without discrimination against race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, birth or status. And indeed now, of course, with other references to gender also, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, all of these protections are echoed quite clearly in our own Constitution and are reflected in the work this government carries out every day. No other government in Fiji in history, Madam Speaker, I repeat, no other government could have ever said the same. Because this constitution actually enables us to be able to implement the conventions, and indeed, as I will seek to elucidate, that the actual practical laws that actually give meat to the substance of the convention itself. I know the other side, Madam Speaker, live in denial of the truth, but I also know that every other Fijian can see very clearly that due to the work of governments, systems of oppression in this country that once suppressed the basic human rights of thousands of our citizens are being dismantled. It is no coincidence that only now is Fiji able to push the ICCPR on the path towards ratification. The Articles of ISCRA call for the right to just working conditions, fair wages, equal pay for equal work, safe and healthy working conditions, equal opportunity in the workplace, the right to form and join trade unions, the right to strike, the right to social security, including social insurance, and the right to an adequate standard of living for all citizens, including adequate food, clothing and housing, including the right to freedom of speech. Madam Speaker, again, these same rights are protected by the Fijian Constitution. A free, responsible, accountable and robust media is critical in fostering a culture of deep and deliberative democracy. Unlike many other constitutional jurisdictions that deem the guarantee of freedom of speech, expression and publication to entail implicit freedom of the press, the Fijian Constitution, through its Bill of Rights, unequivocally recognizes the freedom of the press as pivotal in the materialization of freedom of speech, expression of thought, opinion and publication. We can see every day through the multitude of articles published that we have a vibrant discourse in relation to all facets of the economy, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, it is quite unfortunate that the Honourable Biman Prasad and members of this party have been equating media freedom on the level of editorial impartiality or partiality in a media organisation. I remind this House, Madam Speaker, and members of the opposition once again, that media freedom is about having the freedom and ability to report on issues, however the media organisations choose to. We have a huge grievance with Fiji Times, but they are free to do whatever they like. They have a political proclivity. That's fine. They can do that. This, Madam Speaker, is what we call media freedom. That, Honourable Prasad, is Human Rights 101. Madam Speaker, our Constitution also provides all persons the right to be free from hate speech, whether directed against individuals or groups, and the rights of persons injured by inaccurate or offensive media reports to have a correction published on reasonable conditions established by law. It is prudent to note that the limitations to freedom of speech, expression and publication on the prohibited grounds of discrimination listed in the Constitution are in consonance with CERD under General Recommendation number 35, go and look that up, of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination on combating racist hate speech. Our Constitution has also clearly defined hate speech. Hate speech under our Constitution means an expression in whatever form that encourages or is the effect of encouraging discrimination on the ground listed or prescribed under Section 26 of the Constitution, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, once again the provisions of the Constitution are in line and in harmony with international law. As such, this makes the ratification of human rights instruments far easier and far more efficient. Once again, this government has put Fiji in the best possible position to ensure ratification. Madam Speaker, of course we are seeing a lot of hate speech on social media, and it's unfortunate also many of them are supporters of the opposition, but that's going unbridled, unchecked. Madam Speaker, if you take a step back and look at the even larger picture, what is truly remarkable about the Constitution is that it establishes the principle that every Fijian is equal. It does not define or divide Fijians by ethnicity, as we know those on that side of the House are very quick to do so. Instead, our Constitution bestows the title of Fijian on every citizen of our country, while equally recognizing and protecting their different cultures, customs, traditions, language, land ownership. It is only with that basic level of dignity in place that all Fijians can enjoy the full and equal protection of all the human rights, and this makes it easier for us to translate the ratified instruments into effective laws and policies and move forward with the ratification of the remaining instruments. Madam Speaker, we made tremendous progress since 2006 under the leadership of the Honourable Prime Minister in matching our commitment to these instruments with laws and policies to uphold the rights of the Fijian people. In the case of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, or CERD, when it was ratified in 1973 by Fiji, Fiji made a reservation in relation to the political rights under Article 5C that guarantees the right to participate in elections on the basis of universal and equal suffrage. Madam Speaker, the 1970, the 1990 and the 1997 constitutions all mandated voting along ethnic and racial lines, in blatant disregard of international protocols and conventions. Unfortunately, Madam Speaker, the government of the day decided that not all votes and not all voices in Fiji would equally matter when it came to elections. It was not until this government that Fiji finally shut the door on the backwards and divisive way of thinking and operating. In 2012, it was the Bainimarama government that notified the UN Secretary-General of the withdrawal of the third reservations made at the time of ratification. Many other governments before us had the opportunity to do the same. Many other governments had the opportunity to say no to discriminatory and exclusionary systems of voting and representation. But they chose to remain silent, and they chose to do nothing. They chose to value some Fijians more than others. No matter how hard they may try and make us forget, we remember, Madam Speaker. The Fijian people remember, and they know that it was not until this government and the 2013 Fijian Constitution that the requirement to vote along ethnic or racial or even provincial lines were removed. Madam Speaker, our commitment and action on these issues are why the 2014 general elections was the first election in the Fijian history that was not conducted under a racist and provincialized divisive electoral system. This is why the 2014 general elections were the first to be held freely and fairly, with the full participation of all Fijians, whose votes and voices for the first time, Madam Speaker, whose votes and voices for the first time were held equal value. That is something you don't value. Madam Speaker, this government's work to implement CERD has touched almost every aspect of our national life, including in education, where we did away with discriminatory practices in the granting of scholarships, allowing Fijian students to pursue tertiary education on the basis of their merit and achievement. And I might add, we've recently poured massive new funding into our tertiary loans and scholarships programs. In the civil service, we are also ingraining merit-based recruitment and promotion, as we've outlined in this House many times before, all to improve the level of government services that are delivered to ordinary Fijians throughout the country. As called for in under Article 5 of CERD, other civil liberties such as the rights to equal treatment before the tribunals and all other organs administering justice, security of person and protection by the state against violence or bodily harm, whether inflicted by government officials or by any individual, group or institution, freedom of movement and residence within the border of the state, right to nationality and the ownership of property, the right to freedom of opinion and expression, the right to join trade unions are all echoed in our Constitution. Since ratification of CERD, it was this government that extended an invitation to the 2016 to the Special Rapporteur on the contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia and related intolerance. In his report, which subsequently tabled last year at the Human Rights Council, the Special Rapporteur at the time, Mr. Mutuma Rutere, acknowledged and commended the steps taken by this government to combat racism and discrimination. And we also welcome his recommendations and will take them into consideration in our efforts to build a strong and responsible human rights culture in Fiji. Madam Speaker, allow me to now briefly speak on the progress we made in implementing the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Because truly it is our commitment to the children of Fiji, how we treat our children and how we protect, empower and care for them that will define the future of Fiji. And although, Madam Speaker, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was signed, Madam Speaker, or ratified prior to 2010, the actual practical implementation came into being in 2010 with the coming into effect of the Domestic Violence Act and the Child Welfare Act, Madam Speaker. That actually gave meat or substance to the actual convention. This position has also been reflected in Section 41 of our Constitution, which grants all Fijian children the right to be registered soon after birth and to have a nationality and protects their rights to nutrition, clothing, shelter and health care. It also allows them protection from abuse, neglect, harmful practices of violence, inhumane treatment, punishment and exploitative labor. Section 15(5) of our Constitution also protects children with regards to access to courts and tribunals. Importantly, under Section 11 of the Constitution, Fijians are protected from all forms of violence at home and, most importantly, at school also. Madam Speaker, it is unrestricted access to quality education that is the greatest equalizer in Fijian society. In 2015, for the first time, primary and secondary education became free under the leadership of the Honourable Prime Minister. The free education policy covers all primary and secondary education, including textbooks, building fees, and other fees charged to students at primary and secondary level. In addition, transportation assistance is also provided to children at primary and secondary levels. Moreover, Madam Speaker, we are also the first Fijian government to invite the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to education to visit Fiji in 2015. Madam Speaker, we are also pleased to state that the establishment and protection of women's rights in Fiji are also consistent with the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. Yesterday, the Honourable Minister for Women, Children and Public Education has already answered a question in relation to the implementation of CEDAW and on the recent recommendation made by the CEDAW Committee given the presentation of our CEDAW report in Geneva in February of this year, Madam Speaker. As we have stated many times in this House, Madam Speaker, our Constitution protects all Fijians from unfair discrimination, including on the grounds of sex, gender identity and expression, pregnancy, marital status, culture, religion, social origin, conscience, and social or health status. We also have a Domestic Violence Act, which facilitates the issuance of domestic violence restraining orders. We also echo the words of the Honourable Prime Minister, who has made the elimination of violence against women and children his personal mission, that the attitude of this government is one of zero tolerance for violence against women and girls. The Honourable Prime Minister has said repeatedly that it is completely unacceptable to suggest that the onus is on a woman not to provoke her partner's temper, and that if she does so, that somehow the other justifies or excuses domestic violence. It is that backward way of thinking, Madam Speaker, that gives cowardly men the excuse to justify the unjustifiable and innocent women to accept the unacceptable. Madam Speaker, I have to make a digression here. It's this patriarchal notion that the Minister highlighted that we need to be able to address. It's not about how wealthy or how unwealthy a family is. It's about the patriarchal notions, the imbalances of power differentials that actually causes this imbalance in our society, Madam Speaker. It's not only poor women that get bashed up, it's also rich women that get bashed up too. Madam Speaker, to this end, this government has also set up the first toll-free domestic violence helpline to ensure women in the time of need can make the call and be protected. Also, Madam Speaker, it covers children too and is run by the Women's Crisis Centre. Madam Speaker, in order to, again, a practical application to ensure the rights of women are protected under the Family Law Act, we have ensured that de facto relationships are now recognized, that women in these relationships can claim for maintenance and access to property rights. Furthermore, at the last sitting of Parliament, we passed a bill to amend the Succession, Probate and Administration Act of 1970 to ensure that women in de facto relationships were not discriminated against when it came to inheritance rights. Previous governments again fell short of amending these laws to ensure that our CEDAW commitments were also translated into our national laws and policies, Madam Speaker. Access to justice, Madam Speaker, is a right guaranteed to all Fijians under the Fijian Constitution. This right is the hallmark of the rule of law, and as such we have also expanded the services of the Legal Aid Commission to ensure that there are legal aid services in all urban and peri-urban areas. A very practical application of these rights, Madam Speaker. All of our laws, legislative programs are indiscriminate and are for rural women as much as they are for women or men anywhere in the country, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, again I'd like to touch on the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane and Degrading Treatment, where Fiji is only one of the 2 Pacific Island countries that has actually ratified it, Madam Speaker. We also use as an example for other Pacific Island countries as to how to actually engage in UNCAT and indeed ratify that, Madam Speaker. We have for the first time a Prime Minister has publicly stated that we do not have and never had a state-sanctioned policy of torture. We do not have and never have had a state-sanctioned policy of inflicting cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment in Fiji. It is not an issue we have shied away from, and we will continue to openly speak out against the culture of brutality, or some call buturaki. Madam Speaker, to give effect to the rights under sections 11, 13 and 14 of our Constitution, we have also, through the Legal Aid Commission, embarked on a pilot program called the First Hour Procedure, in collaboration with the Fiji Police Force and the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission, and indeed the judiciary. The First Hour Procedure ensures the provision of counsel to every suspect at the police station within 1 hour of arrest, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, again, this Parliament ratified the CRPD. For the first time now, we have a law that gives substance to people with disabilities. We ratified the International Convention in that respect. We carry out many practical examples where under the land transport regulations, disabled persons, they are given first priority. They are allowed to bring in their dogs should their blind person need what they call, animal assistant they require, Madam Speaker. We've also given now, for example, tax rebates to anybody that employs disabled persons, 300% tax rebate. These are really very practical applications of these conventions and these rights on a daily basis, Madam Speaker. Of course, Madam Speaker, we have also been working with various other municipal councils and Fiji Roads Authority, retrofitting public toilets, retrofitting footpaths. These are again very practical notions of the implementation of the conventions. No point having this huge ceremony and signing this convention, but it practically does not translate, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, again, the Elections Office has special provisions for persons with disabilities. Madam Speaker, we'd like to now once again say that we urge Parliament to work together with our policy of ratifying the big 9 conventions. We'll be ratifying hopefully another 2 in the next session of Parliament, and we'll have only 2 left. And again, Madam Speaker, we need to ensure that these international conventions that we do sign are given practical application and indeed are translated into very tangible results for the ordinary people. Because we will, Madam Speaker, will only be judged by how much we bring those in the margin of society, how much we mainstream them. Thank you, Madam Speaker.